Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, I want to try to put the Unreal Engine 5 situation to bed. Well, at least the best I can. Because so many of you have been DMing me, emailing me, Facebook messaging me, and so on regarding this, asking my opinion, and I am appreciative of people, well, valuing my opinion, but I've just received so many messages it's almost impossible for me to respond to every single one of them, so I wanted to put a just video out just to make it as hopefully clear as possible. Now, Amy, in a video yesterday, she covered the fact that Tim Sweeney as well as Epic have confirmed, unsurprisingly, that Unreal Engine would run on the Xbox Series X as well as the PC. Obviously, the purpose of Unreal Engine is to make it easy for games developers to create titles. They don't need to worry about actually building the engine itself. They can scale the engine according to their needs, so whether it's an indie platformer which is 2D based or some massive AAA experience with tons of 3D assets and a massive open game world, by golly gosh, that's good to go. And also, with Unreal Engine, it's consistently updated based upon new advancements in software, but also new advancements in hardware. For example, back when the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One were launching, we saw the release of Unreal Engine 4, which had numerous improvements to it, and I discussed that quite extensively back in the day. And the Elemental demo, for example, was extremely awesome for the Unreal Engine 4 debut. But with Unreal Engine 5, Epic decided to release around 7 minutes of gameplay of a title they've been creating. Whether it ends up actually being a game they release or not, who the hell knows. But it was around 7 minutes of gameplay of a game which kind of looked a bit like Tomb Raider-ish, but with some more magical elements. And basically it was running at 1440p at 30 FPS. And had various new technology, which the 5th generation of Unreal Engine is really pioneering, such as nanite. We'll get into what that is in just a moment, I promise, but I'm trying to set the scene first. But a lot of confusion really started to stem from, well, first of all, comments from Epic regarding the speed of the SSD inside the PlayStation 5. And clearly, if you compare the SSD inside either of the next generation consoles against the slow-ass drives that we have in the current generation consoles, or even a mechanical drive inside of a PC, well, there is no comparison. Quite simply put, the next generation consoles ruffle stomp either a traditional mechanical drive on the PC or the older generation consoles, and this is why I've said multiple times that I believe that PCs need to go the route of either drastically increasing the pool of memory they have. Most gaming PCs now have 16 gigabytes, some people have 32, but it's not very common, and so I think 32 gigabytes is going to become a pretty recommended spec for next generation PC gaming. And also, of course, the amount of VRAM might slightly increase on next generation GPUs, but realistically the amount of system memory is going to increase. And I also predict that SSDs are going to most likely become very much part of PCs over the next couple of years. But there was even further confusion when a website, Bilibili, had an upload of a Chinese presentation. This was actually Epic China, of what looked like the demo running on a laptop. Now, this has been subsequently pulled down, but basically lots of people were confused as, well, what the hell's going on here? Because there was a quote, which was in Chinese and Cantonese, that basically said that the frame rate was around 40 FPS. According to native speakers, that's what they translated it as. However, according to Tim Sweeney, who did some investigations, what he said is that the game was actually not being played on the laptop. Instead, it was a video of the PlayStation 5 development kit version He actually said it was an MP4. Indeed, he said you can actually kind of see that at the top of the video, but once again, this has been removed now. It looks like it's been DMCA'd. And basically, the demo was not being played live. It was a pre-recording. Furthermore, as for the 40 FPS mention, so what apparently this was in relation to was that the game on the PlayStation 5 development kit was actually hitting 40 FPS if VSync was disabled. However, because of how TV standards blah 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 work, they instead decided to lock the game to 30 FPS, and this also means that you have more consistent frame times. I've explained what frame times are before, but the long and the short of it is, when you are drawing frames on screen, it obviously takes a delay from one frame to the next frame to render. So if you're targeting a frame rate of 30 FPS, on average, you need to put a new frame on screen every 33.3 ms. If you are targeting 60 FPS, you only have half the time, so 16.6 ms, and so on and so on. The thing is, though, frame time variants are a pain in the ass, and you can kind of notice them. So, for example, let's say you have one frame spit out at 40 ms, and another one at 27 ms, and then another one at 33 ms, and so on. You basically get bad frame pacing, and it just doesn't feel good to play. And if you've noticed a game which does have a consistent frame rate but poor hitching, that's one of the reasons. And this is also a problem with older implementations of SLI on the PC. I will be going much deeper into the next generation aspects of Unreal Engine, and it is worth noting that it's not released yet. It is not in public access. Even games developers don't really have free access to this either, and also there are a number of aspects to the engine which are being held back in terms of being demoed to the public because of NDAs. This is what Tim Sweeney himself has said numerous times in response to the deluge of tags he's been getting on Twitter. But there have been two pieces of technology in particular which has been demoed on this whatever game trailer. I'm just going to call it the Epic game. Anyway, one of those is Lumen and the other is Nanite. And Lumen is kind of a bit different to traditional ray tracing. It basically is real-time global illumination. So rather than illumination, GI being baked into a specific scene, which essentially means it's not interactive, it is kind of a hybrid approach between pixel-based ray tracing, which NVIDIA's RTX technology uses, and global illumination, basically reducing the overhead of ray tracing, albeit without the accuracy of pixel-based ray tracing. So, for example, and it does depend on the size of the object that is receiving the ray tracing goodness, the lumen goodness, I suppose, to be technically accurate in this case. So what they will do is they will use something like voxels to roughly approximate how an object would be illuminated by real-time lighting. So once again, it isn't as accurate, and I will stress go into this much more in depth into another video. But long story short, although it isn't as accurate as RTX technology, which is once again on a per pixel basis, it is considerably less intensive in terms of GPU utilization. And I suspect, therefore, that Unreal Engine is going to heavily depend on what you're trying to do with it. And ultimately, currently, we do not have any benchmarks. So what I'm trying to say is that it's very difficult to have any guesses as to how PC hardware, for example, will run the game. Even Tim Sweeney himself has admitted that, to be honest, they're still doing testing, especially as the engine itself is still being bought up. In other words, it's not finished yet. But also, if you take the consoles themselves, I would imagine that Lumen most likely will run better on the Xbox Series X, or at least theoretically it could, simply because the higher amount of compute performance on the Xbox's GPU. Basically, I don't want to get super technical in this video, as I've said a couple of times now, but long story short, the Xbox Series X's GPU just do more calculations, whereas the PlayStation 5's SSD looks like it could handle more data transferring to and from the SSD. So Nanite will probably work slightly better on the PlayStation 5. The question is, though, how much of a difference is there between, let's say, Lumen running on the PlayStation 5 versus the Xbox Series X? And a lot of this will also come down quite simply to the games themselves. And don't forget that it will also depend what technology a developer decides to incorporate into their game as how the console is used. Also, to my understanding, this demo was constructed with earlier development kits for the PlayStation 5. So this is not necessarily representative of final production hardware. And honestly, I still would not be surprised if specs do change slightly for the final release of the consoles. Now, I'm not leaking this. I do not want you to misquote me and say that a source has told me this. I'm just simply saying, until retail hardware hits store shelves, specs can change slightly. We will not see an increase in the number of compute units on a GPU. We will not see an additional 4 CPU cores be added. But memory bandwidth can change, clock frequencies can adjust. I still wouldn't be awfully surprised if Microsoft did crank up the GPU frequency of the Xbox Series X. It would be a pretty good win for them if they could do that. It would basically mean that the caches would run faster. It's not about the T-flops here. Microsoft would get a lot out of just simply cranking up the clock frequency a little bit, and it would actually eliminate some of the advantage Sony has with its narrower, faster design, basically pure throughput. Sony, meanwhile, I would be interested if they go with faster memory in the PlayStation 5's design. The only thing is, of course, with Sony to do that, it would increase the cost of the system, which is allegedly a big concern. And for Microsoft to increase the clock frequency of the GPU, it would also increase the TDP power consumption of the system itself. And for memory, it's 300 watts. Which is kind of high. The PlayStation 3 was 380 watts back in the day, but that was a very different time. The PlayStation 3 actually got a lot of criticism for how power hungry it was, but will Microsoft decide to crank up the performance? Well, ultimately it depends whether their cooling system can handle it. I think it can. Most likely it wouldn't drastically increase the heat output of the system, providing it was only a modest bump in GPU performance. But I guess we'll have to see. As for how well Unreal Engine works on both consoles, I think it will depend. Like, my personal opinion is that if you have a game that is being developed by a AAA studio, let's say Ubisoft, Electronic Arts, that type of thing, realistically, neither console is going to be pushed to their absolute limit. For obvious reasons. Developers have finite resources. To me, some of the cool elements of Unreal Engine, especially when it comes to, let's say, Lumen or Nanite, is the fact that it actually frees up artists' time as well, because doing something like baked-in global illumination is, well, let's just say the words pain in the ass. So doing something like this, having access to this, I think will benefit us overall. And as I mentioned in a previous video, I'll try to remember to link it in the video description, both Sony and Microsoft did not compromise the design of their consoles. They designed the systems to be better at different things. So because of this, naturally, if you have a game engine, it's going to perform differently in different tasks. It's not to say that it's going to suck in an area where it's weaker at. It's just not going to be as strong as the other console. And to me, this is a little bit, I don't want to say Xbox 360 versus PS3, but I suppose it is in a way, with the Xbox 360's GPU being just easier to program. It had more advanced features in many ways. It had a unified memory architecture, which also was a massive benefit to it, whereas the PlayStation 3's CPU was very difficult to program for, yes, but had an awful lot of performance. And the differences here, of course, between the PS5 and Xbox are very, well, different compared to what we saw with that generation. I'm just simply saying that the hardware itself is fundamentally designed for different purposes. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing what the next generation brings to the table. Hopefully, this, well, to be honest with you, very unplanned video, because I'm working on something entirely different on how next generation graphics will evolve. Hopefully, this kind of answers a few of your questions and you found it somewhat informative or helpful. I don't know. But with all of that said, thank you very much for all of the DMs and Twitter messages and so on. As I said, that's the reason I'm putting this video out. But hopefully, I will see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.